As I've written before and publicly stated in interviews, the vast majority of people, when looking at Washington, D.C. and at the Vatican, they never comprehend how those cities constitute one of the greatest open conspiracies of all time. There, reproduced in all of their glory and right before the world's eyes, is an ancient talisman diagram. It's based on the history and cult of Isis, Osiris, and Horus, including the magical utilities, Mat, to generate the deity's return. The primeval concept, especially that of sacred domes facing obelisks, this is something that was designed in antiquity for the express purpose of regeneration, resurrection, and apotheosis, for deity incarnation from the underworld to the earth's surface through union of respective figures. The dome, the ancient structural representation of the womb of Isis, and the obelisk, the ancient representation of the erect male phallus of Osiris. That layout, as modeled in antiquity, exists today on the grandest scale at the heart of the capital of the most important government, most powerful government on earth, the United States, as well as in the heart of the most politically influential church on earth, the Vatican. Now, given this fact and the pattern provided by the Apostle Paul and the Apocalypse of John, the book of Revelation, that the end times would culminate in a marriage between political, that is Antichrist, and religious, that is false prophet, authorities at the return of Osiris Apollo, it really does behoove open-minded researchers to carefully consider these prophecies in stone, as it defines the spiritual energy that's knowingly or unknowingly being invoked at both locations with potential ramifications for the year 2025 and beyond. The U.S. Capitol has been called the Mirror Vatican due to the strikingly similar layout and design of its primary buildings and streets. Now, that's no accident. In fact, America's forefathers first named the capital city Rome. But the parallelism between Washington and the Vatican is most clearly illustrated by the Capitol building and dome facing the obelisk known as the Washington Monument, and at St. Peter's Square Basilica in the Vatican by a similar dome facing a familiar obelisk, both of which were, according to their own official records, fashioned after the Roman Pantheon, the circular domed rotunda dedicated to all pagan gods. Now, this layout, a domed temple facing an obelisk, is an ancient alchemical blueprint that holds significant esoteric meaning. For those who may not know, the U.S. Capitol building in Washington, D.C. is historically based on a pagan Masonic temple theme. Thomas Jefferson, who shepherded the anti-Christian Roman Pantheon design, wrote to the Capitol's architect Benjamin Latrobe, defining it as, quote, the first temple dedicated to embellishing with Athenian taste the course of a nation looking far beyond the range of Athenian destinies, end quote. The Athenian Empire was, of course, first known as Osiria, the kingdom of Osiris. In 1833, Massachusetts Representative Rufus Coyote agreed, writing, quote, we have built no national temples but the Capitol, end quote. Now, to understand what these statements may soon mean for the future of the world, one needs to comprehend how these apparati, the dome and the obelisk facing it, facilitate important archaic and modern protocols for invigorating prophetic supernatural alchemy. In ancient times, the obelisk represented the god Osiris's missing male organ, which Isis was not able to find after her husband brother was slain and chopped into 14 pieces by his evil brother Set. The story involves a detailed account of the envious brother and 72, that's an important number, conspirators tricking Osiris into climbing inside of a box, which Set quickly locked and threw into the Nile. Osiris drowned, and his body floated down the Nile River where it snagged on the limbs of a tamarisk tree. In Byblos, Isis recovered his body from the riverbank and took it into her care, but in her absence, Seth stole the body again, and this time chopped it into 14 pieces, which he threw back into the Nile. Isis searched the riverbank until she recovered every piece except for the genitals, which had been swallowed by a fish. Isis recombined the 13 pieces of Osiris' corpse and replaced the missing organ with a magic facsimile, an obelisk, which she used to impregnate herself during the very first raising of Osiris ceremony, in which she called forth the seed of the dead god from the underworld up through the magic device, thus giving rise to Osiris again in the person of his son, Horus. Now, this legendary ritual for reincarnating Osiris formed the core of Egyptian cosmology, as well as the Rosicrucian Masonic dying and rising myths, and was fantastically venerated on the most imposing scale throughout all of Egypt by towering obelisks representing the phallus of Osiris and domes representing the pregnant belly of Isis, including at Karnak, where the upright obelisks were vitalized or stimulated from the energy of the masturbatory sun god Ra shining down upon them. In Egypt, where rituals were performed to actually raise the spirit of Osiris into the reigning pharaoh, political authority in the form of divine kingship or theocratic statesmanship was established, later reflected in the political and religious doctrine of royal and political legitimacy, or the divine right of kings, who supposedly derived their right to rule from the will of God, with the exception, in some countries, that the king is subject to the church and to the pope. But this meant, among other things, that the Egyptian pharaoh enjoyed extraordinary authority as the son of the sun god Ra and the incarnation of the falcon god Horus during his lifetime. At death, Pharaoh would become the Osiris, the divine judge of the netherworld, and on earth his son and predecessor would take his place as the newly anointed manifestation of Horus. So each generation of pharaohs provided the gods with a spokesman for the present world and for the afterlife, while also offering the nation divinely appointed leadership. And yet the observant listener may wonder, was there something more to the pharaoh's deification than faith in ritual magic? Well, the cult center of Amun-Ra at Thebes may actually hold the answer, as it was the site of the largest religious structure ever built, the Temple of Amun-Ra at Karnak, and the location of many extraordinary, mysterious rites. The great temple, with its miles of walls and gardens, the primary object by the way of fascination and worship by the nemesis of Moses, the pharaoh of the Exodus, Ramses II, was the place where each pharaoh reconciled his divinity in the company of Amun-Ra during the festival of Opet. Now, the festival was held at the Temple of Luxor, and it included a procession of gods carried on barges up the Nile River from Karnak to the temple. The royal family would accompany the gods on boats, while the Egyptian laity would walk along the shore, calling out and making requests of the gods. But once at Luxor, the pharaoh and his entourage would enter the Holy of Holies, the Temple of Isis, the domed belly, where the ceremony to raise the spirit of Osiris into the king would be performed, the raising of Osiris ceremony, by the magicians of Egypt. And don't forget, these men were very powerful, as they were able to mimic almost all of the miracles conducted by God through the hand of Moses during the Exodus. But in any case, it was truly believed that Pharaoh at that moment would be transmogrified into a living deity, Osiris in flesh. Outside, large groups of dancers and musicians would wait anxiously, and then when the king emerged as the born-again Osiris, the crowd would erupt in gaiety. And from that day forward, the pharaoh would be considered to be, just as the god ciphered on the Great Seal of the United States will be, the son and spiritual incarnation of the supreme deity, the all-seeing eye, of Horus, Apollo, Osiris above the unfinished pyramid on the Great Seal represents that event. Now fast forward to today, and at the inauguration of every American president, across town at the House of the Temple, the modern Egyptian magicians, the Freemasons, Scottish Rite, 33rd degree, are conducting the raising of Osiris ceremony to call the seat of Osiris Apollo from the underworld through the Washington Monument obelisk, where it magically emits into the U.S. Capitol dome, while America's new leader is standing there accepting his role as the living representative of Osiris. This is done in anticipation of the day when events are going to surpass parity, and the beast that was and is not shall ascend out of the bottomless pit and go into perdition, the Greek word Apollo. And they that dwell on earth shall wonder whose names were not written in the book of life from the foundation of the world, when they behold the beast that was and is not, and yet is. Revelation 17:8. For a few adepts of history and secret orders, this DC ritual is deliciously staged, as even the term inaugurate is from the Latin inauguratio, and it refers to the archaic ceremony by which the Roman augurs or soothsayers would approve a king or a ruler through omens as being sanctioned by the god Jupiter, the same entities whose prophecies on the Great Seal herald his upcoming challenge to Yahweh Jehovah for heavenly supremacy, while his son Apollo Osiris seizes authority over the world in a final pagan golden age. As pointed out in my new book, Zeitgeist 2025, the dome where U.S. presidents stand during their inauguration and where they lie in state for their spirit to rise into the apotheosis overhead to join George Washington in the kingdom of Osiris at death alone is an unparalleled magical construct that openly hides the most formidable ancient supernaturalism meant for regeneration of Apollo Osiris. In fact, I would go so far as to say it is a satanic antichrist plagiarism of the death, burial, and resurrection of Jesus Christ that I believe is going to play a role in the healing of Antichrist after he experiences a deadly head wound in Revelation 13:3. Note that the 1865 apotheosis of Washington, painted by Greek-Italian artist Constantino Brumidi, is visible through the oculus of the dome in the rotunda, and it bears anything but Christian symbols. It's filled with Greco-Roman gods to whom Thomas Jefferson dedicated the United States. The very term apotheosis means to become a god, or revived eternal being. Now, in this depiction, Washington is becoming Osiris of the afterlife. The gods in the painting surrounding Washington are depicting helping the founders establish a more perfect union, as in the New Atlantis scheme that I go into the details of in Zeitgeist 2025. Directly beneath the apotheosis are 72 pentagrams, forming a sorcerous gateway used by secret society members and occultists to bind and loose the 72 fallen angels that reside over the heathen nations. You can learn more about that in Psalms 82, Deuteronomy 32, and so on. Finally, under the floor of the rotunda is the U.S. National Crypt, where an empty tomb resides. He is not here, for he is risen. This is where I argue that Antichrist will be taken after his head injury, and the Freemasons will conduct the raising of Osiris ceremony, at which time he will be transmogrified into the living incarnation of Osiris Apollo. Now, there is more to the Capitol Dome, Antichrist plagiarism of the life of Christ, that I go into in Zeitgeist 2025 than these aspects of the building's design might infer. But these points of interest clearly reveal how the architects imagined a dark parody of Jesus. How so? Well, as Jesus died and rose into heaven, so Washington rises to become the Osiris in the top of the U.S. Capitol Dome. As the 72 pentagrams in the Capitol Dome are used to control the 72 cosmocrators over the nation, Jesus too confronted the 72 fallen watchers, from the base of Mount Hermon to his visit in the underworld and final ascension into heaven, whereby he proclaimed in Revelation 1:18, "I am he that liveth and was dead, and behold, I am alive forevermore," which is a clear denunciation of the Osiris dying and rising god myth that was so popular during his first advent. He goes on, "Amen, and have the keys of hell." This is the word Hades, the names that the Greeks gave to Osiris, and of death, end quote. It's important because Osiris was the lord of the underworld in Greek myth who possessed the keys to the 12 gates of Egyptian afterlife. Much has been written by historians within and without Masonry as to the relevance of the number 72 and the alchemy related to it. For instance, in Kabbalah, Freemasonry, and Jewish apocalyptic writings, the number 72 equals the total of wings that Enoch received when he's transformed into the powerful angel Metatron. You could see 3 Enoch 9:2 for more on that. And this plays an important role for the Brotherhood, as Metatron was also known as the angel in the whirlwind, who was enabled as the guiding spirit over America during George W. Bush's administration for the purpose of directing the future and fate of the United States, as was also prayed by Congressman Major R. Owens of New York before the House of Representatives on Wednesday, February 28, 2001. But in the context of the Capitol Dome and the 72 stars that circle Washington's apotheosis in the womb of Isis, the significance of this symbolism is far more important. In sacred literature, including the Bible, stars are symbolic of angels, and within Masonic Gnosticism, these 72 powerful entities, reflected in the 72 conspirators that controlled Osiris's life in Egyptian myth, currently administer the affairs of earth under Satan, the god of this world, according to 2 Corinthians 4:4. Experts in the study of the divine council believe that, beginning at the Tower of Babel, the world and its inhabitants were disinherited by the sovereign God of Israel and placed under the authority of 72 angels. These angels became corrupt and disloyal to God in their administration of those nations, according to Psalms 82. These beings quickly became worshipped on earth as gods following Babel, led by Nimrod, Gilgamesh, Osiris, Apollo. Consistent within this tradition, the designers of the Capitol Dome, the Great Seal of the United States, and the Obelisk Washington Monument circled the apotheosis of Washington with 72 pentagram stars. They dedicated the obelisk 72 years after the signing of the Declaration of Independence, and they placed 72 stones on the Great Seal's uncapped pyramid, above which the prophetic eye of Horus, Osiris, Apollo stares. These 3 sets of 72, combined with the imagery and occult numerology of the Osiris obelisk, the Isis dome, and the oracular Great Seal, are richly symbolic of the influence of Satan and his angels over the world, according to Luke 4, 2 Corinthians 4, Ephesians 6, and other scripture, with a prophecy towards Satan's final earthly empire, the coming Novus Ordo Seclorum, or new pagan golden age. Now, in order for the inevitable worship of Osiris to be reestablished on earth, the 72 demons that govern the nations have to be controlled. Therefore, they are set in magical constraints on the Great Seal, the Washington obelisk, and the pentagram circles around the apotheosis of Washington in order to bind and force the desired effect. In The Secret Destiny of America, famous Freemason Manly P. Hall noted as well that the 72 stones on the pyramid on the Great Seal correspond to the 72 arrangements of the Tetragrammaton, or the 4-lettered name of God in Hebrew. He wrote this: "These 4 letters can be combined in 72 combinations, resulting in what is called the Shemhamphorash, which represents in turn the laws, powers, and energies of nature," end quote. Now, folks, the idea that the mystical name of God could be invoked to bind or release those supernatural agents, or powers and energies of nature, as Hall called them, is meaningful creed within many occult tenets, including Kabbalah and Freemasonry. This is why the 72 stars are pentagram-shaped around the deified Freemason George Washington. Medieval books of magic, or grimoires such as the Key of Solomon and the Lesser Key of Solomon, not only identify the star systems Orion, or Osiris, and Pleiades, Apollo, as the home of these powers, but applies great importance to the pentagram shape of the stars for binding and releasing their influence. Adept Rosicrucians and Freemasons have long used these magical texts, the Key of Solomon and the Lesser Key of Solomon, to do just that. Modern people, especially in America, may view all of these symbols used in this magic, especially the dome representing the habitually pregnant belly of Isis, and the obelisk representing the erect phallus of Osiris, as profane or pornographic. But they were in fact ritualized fertility objects, which the ancients believed could produce tangible reactions, properties, or manifestations within the material world. The obelisk and dome, as imitations of the deity's male and female reproductive organs, could, through government representation, invoke into existence the being or beings symbolized by them. And that is why inside the temple or dome, prostitutes representing the human manifestation of the goddess were also available for ritual sex as a form of imitative magic. Through such imitative sex, the dome and obelisk became energy receivers, capable of assimilating Ra's essence from the rays of the sun, which in turn would draw forth the seed of the underworld Osiris. The seed of the dead entity would, according to the supernaturalism, transmit upward from out of the underworld through the base or testes of the obelisk and magically emit from the tower's head into the womb or dome of Isis, where incarnation into the sitting pharaoh, king, or president would occur during what Freemasons also call the raising of Osiris ceremony. In this way, Osiris could be habitually born again or reincarnated as Horus and constantly direct the spiritual destiny of the nation. Something most people do not know and will be shocked to learn in my new book is that the Freemasons even constructed a symbolic seed of Osiris at the Washington Monument obelisk. If an anatomically correct phallus is placed over the Washington Monument, right in the testicular section beneath a manhole cover, where it should be, is a miniature 12-foot tall obelisk hidden just beneath the surface of the ground, representing the seat of Osiris. The number 12, of course, is the biblical and occult numerology for perfect government. In this case, that new world order over which Osiris Apollo is going to reign, when the beast that thou sawest was and is not, and shall ascend out of the bottomless pit and go into perdition, rises at the end of time to oversee the dawn of a new golden age. This metaphysical phenomenon of deity resurrection involving mystical seed reminds of the messianic proto-evangelium promise, and I will put enmity between thee and the woman, and between thy seed and her seed. It shall bruise thy head, and thou shalt bruise his heel, Genesis 3:15, which for occultists was countered by Nimrod Semiramis and was central to numerous other ancient cultures, especially developed in Egypt, where Nimrod Semiramis were known as Osiris and Isis. And in Ezekiel chapter 8, the children of Israel set up the obelisk or image of jealousy. You can see that in verse 5, facing the entry of their temple, just as the dome faces the obelisk in Washington, D.C., and in the Vatican City, and were condemned by God for worshiping the sun, or Ra, while weeping for Osiris or Tammuz. The familiar Masonic figure of the point within a circle, is the symbol of this union between Ra, Osiris, and Isis. The point represents Osiris's phallus in the center of the circle or womb of Isis, which in turn is enlivened by the sun rays of Ra, just as today at the Vatican, where the Egyptian obelisk of Osiris sits within a circle, and in Washington, D.C., where the obelisk does similarly, situated so as to be the first thing that the sun, or Ra, strikes as it rises over the capital city, and which, when viewed from overhead, forms this magical point within a circle known as a circumpunct. The sorcery is further amplified, according to ancient occultic beliefs, by the presence of the reflecting pool in Washington, D.C., which serves as a mirror to heaven and a transferring point for those spirits and energies. And just what is it that the spirits see when they look downward on the reflecting pool in Washington? They find a city dedicated to and built in honor of the legendary deities Isis and Osiris, complete with the 13 gathered pieces of Osiris, America's original 13 colonies, the required obelisk known as the Washington Monument, the Capitol Dome of Isis for impregnation and incarnation of deity into each pharaoh or president, and last but not least, the official government buildings erected to face their respective counterparts and whose cornerstones, including the U.S. Capitol Dome, were dedicated during astrological alignment related to the zodiacal constellation Virgo or Isis, as required for the magic to occur. The information that I just shared with you is only the tip of the iceberg of what I reveal in my new book, Zeitgeist 2025. In fact, much of what I uncover in this book is too hot for mainstream platforms like YouTube and Facebook and would immediately be censored. But now, for the first time ever, you are going to discover hidden secrets and forgotten prophecies surrounding the year 2025, how the current U.S. government is tied to America's occult destiny, lost prophecies from Qumran forecasting 2025 as the final age of man, why historians and intelligence agencies foresee a totalitarian world government by 2025, how America's capital city is laid out to actuate the arrival of the Antichrist, about the malevolent Orwellian Trinity currently converging, the means by which the population's thinking and speaking are being homogenized to create a nation of assimilated devotees who are going to embrace the Antichrist, the deep esoteric meanings that names and titles held in ancient societies, the impact they had upon destiny, and what that precedent could mean now for America's near future. Who the mysterious character Melchizedek of Genesis 14 truly was, what the people of the name covenant is, and much more. So go to sidroth.org/horn or click the link below to get your digital copy of my revelatory new book, Zeitgeist 2025, so you can count yourself among the ones prepared for what is coming next.